recorded live.
Hello and welcome to the Castle Talk podcast, where we talk to writers and creators of today's genre worlds. From Denver, Colorado, I'm your host, Jason Henderson, author of the Alex Van Helsing series from HarperCollins. Tonight, Bradford Tatum was a staff writer for Dick Wolf on NBC's Deadline and has written and directed 2 award-winning films. His novel, I Can Give You Everything, won both the 2011 Next Generation Indie Book Award and the 2011 Independent Publisher Book Award. He lives in L.A. with his wife and daughter, and his new book is Only the Dead Know Burbank from Harper Perennial. It is brand new, and what the publisher says about it, it is a mesmerizing tale of the original story of Maddie Ulm, an immortal girl secretly responsible for the birth of horror cinema. And it's actually getting really good reviews. And I understand that this comes from, Bradford, your extreme knowledge of horror. So, welcome, and let's get into it. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, all right. At the center of this book, the book covers the birth, the pre-era of cinema through the birth of horror cinema. Can you explain the mysterious character that is guiding us through that?
Well, let me begin by saying what a pussy I am when it comes to real, like what's considered horror today, like the gore and the shock and, like what James Wan is making and Eli Roth, and I have this tremendous appreciation for it. But, I almost went into a coma after stupidly seeing The Exorcist when I was, 10 or 11. I mean, I think Friedkin had just released it as an X. One of my most clear memories as a child is my father screaming in terror the day he saw, he came home and took a nap after seeing The Exorcist. And he was just saying that this is the most horrifying film in the world. This is the most terrifying thing ever seen. Don't ever see it. And, kids now laugh at it. But in my day, that was terrifying. So where I took comfort, as a kid, was on the old creature feature. There was Shock Theater in the East. I think there was Zachary Lee, the cool ghoul, was the host. And, in the 50s, it was Vampira with Shock Theater.
Yeah, Vampira, at least on the West Coast, you had Vampira.
Right.
Absolutely.
So they were kind of revitalizing all of these old horror films. And so as a kid, since real horror was kind of too much for me, that horror was comforting and mysterious and, cozy and gothic. And we didn't get a lot of rain in California, clearly, but it felt as if a wonderful rainy day, even though it was 80 degrees out and your friends were surfing, I could go inside and watch these great films. And I had the Aurora model kits. And so I was very much in that world, and it got me thinking, as I was always writing and maturing and going in other directions, there was this very young part of myself that really wanted to have some fun and share the joy of those old films with an audience somehow. And I didn't quite know how I was going to do it. And then I, had a daughter of my own. And I started to tell her the stories and show her those movies and show her the Bud Abbott, Lou Costello versions. And, we just had a lot of fun doing that stuff. And the idea of the character being a little girl was because the story originally was for my daughter. She was 7 at the time, and we were walking through Central Park. My wife was working on, all my children, and we were broke. We were paying more for our rent than we were for our mortgage back in California, so we had no money, and we had to spend our days outside. It was a fall day in New York, and there were all of these piles of dirt and debris all over Central Park. And my little daughter, 7 years old, says, "Dad, what are those piles of dirt?" And I said, "Oh, wow, yeah, glad you asked. Those are the graves of the vampire children at Central Park, vampire children from all the different eras of New York City, from the silent era to, the kind of gangster in the mall era to, the 50s to, James Dean. All of them are buried in these mounds." And then I stuck my hand into one of these mounds and realized it was a pile of cow shit and that it was fertilizer that they used to fertilize the park. But the idea of this vampire girl who kind of was, alive and well, struck me, and I thought, I don't want to do vampires. I want to do something else, and I don't really know shit about New York City. I'm from L.A. I know Los Angeles. So how about the vampire girl of Griffith Park, which sounded like shit. So I said I'd drop that. And I started thinking about what would it be like if a child actually had that kind of knowledge. And, think about Hollywood. And it's hard enough for a woman to get a break in Hollywood. Imagine if it was a female child who didn't want to be, little Peggy or Jackie Coogan or Shirley Temple.
Yeah.
She wanted to be, Jo von Sternberg. I'm like, wow, there's some wonderful conflict there. So I thought, well, let's go back to the beginning. Because horror was a genre that was imported from post-war Germany after Germany lost the First World War, and there was the whole, and then went through Weimar and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And you're looking at the paintings of Otto Dix and all those paintings. That's kind of what starts.
That hardcore German expressionism.
That hardcore German expressionism is what
falling down strangely tilted buildings and.
That's it, because that's like a manifestation of the interior states of a country that thought it was, immutable, and it lost a war it never thought it would lose, and so it was like in shock. Yeah. And so people like Robert Wien, such and such, Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, all of these movies start getting made at UFA, and UFA up to that point was basically making hygiene films for the Wehrmacht.
Yeah.
So they weren't even established. So there was this weird little cult of, Lubitsch and Lang and Wien and Murnau had his own kind of weird kind of supernatural film company, Prana Films, that I don't really deal with because those are the guys who did Nosferatu. But so I kind of begin it with her getting involved with UFA in those very, very early days. And the reason that she has an insight is because she's basically died from the Spanish influenza, and her mother is a witch from a village not far from Ulm, where witches are as like ubiquitous as Starbucks are to us, because it's an ancient German village. And so there's this thing called the kindest curse, where basically you can suspend someone you love. They don't live and they don't die. They don't eat. They don't really breathe. They exist and they can absorb information, but it's a way to stop people from departing. And since the mother couldn't let her daughter die, she performs this on her kid when she's, 11 or 12 years old, not realizing that she's kind of cursed this child to mature sexually, emotionally, artistically, and psychically, but never physically. And so this girl who already has kind of a fascination with film before this doesn't quite know what to do with this tremendous insight into the dark side, which she innately has.
Yeah. And
so her tutor is basically the ghost of her father, or her mother's pimp. It's revealed that, I don't want to give too much away. So she's basically tutored by a ghost who has a very strong insight. She herself is not quite undead, not quite, she's this kind of spectral other. And so those kinds of experiences combined get her excited about joining this German expressionist film movement. And she starts as a camera operator and works her way up, and actually makes a film that gets a release in the States. And in those days, Carl Laemmle had an agreement, being German himself.
Yeah.
He had an agreement with UFA, and some of those movies would be released with American subtitles. And so she's taken to America to do this film. But as soon as they lay eyes on her, they realize, no. We want the director of the movie, the name of the movie is The Toy Maker. We want the director of The Toy Maker. You're a 10-year-old German kid. No. We can't put you under contract. So right there, she realizes that she's going to have to really, really work her way up through the Hollywood system now, because that insight doesn't fade as much as no one takes her seriously physically. And what's fascinating for her is that, in Hollywood, people are pretending to be younger than they are. They're pretending to be, they wear wigs to pretend they have hair. They change their accent to pretend that they're not from weird little eddies of society. Well, Maddie has to pretend she's actually alive. She breathes and she warms her hand, and she basically has to create this whole myth about herself in order just to stay on the lot. And this, brings her into contact with people like Lon Chaney, who's in that time, 1926, 27, is editing The Phantom of the Opera, and so she's very inspirational in that.
Well, if I can interrupt you for just a second, what I wanted to ask you actually about that, like going into the Lon Chaney stuff like that, exactly. I mean, because you just narrated us through Germany at the time of that silent revolution. You know, that German expressionist revolution, and then so to an extent, and now she's in, you know, a silent American film, the dawn of the Universal era, with Lon Chaney and you know, the Phantom. So it's, forgive me for saying this, but this is like a Forrest Gump for horror movies in a sense. I mean, she is, you know, or Zelig. You know, she's moving through.
Well, I mean, it is and it isn't. I mean, if you do go back to, I mean, when I did my research, and I did a lot of research, there's a wonderful book by a guy named, I think, Kenneth Brownlow called The Parade's Gone By, and it's an oral history of silent Hollywood, silent era Hollywood. It's a relatively small town in those days, in the 20s. People like, you know, Wild Bill Wyler were literally, you know, getting off the airfield from World War I and saying, oh, I could shoot you a dogfight, and he goes off and makes something like Wings. Right. Wins the first Academy Award. So, you know, you didn't have to be the son. That was the... Or you know, Gary Cooper, who literally was a Montana cowboy, who got the job because he could fall flat on his face without screaming. I mean, his first film, The Frontiersman. I mean, I think the point being that, you know, the lots were really populated by a lot fewer people. There were a lot fewer deals. There really was Carl Laemmle and Carl Laemmle Jr. were kind of the head of production. It was a bit more of a quaint town in those days. So the possibility, especially if you're working in the kind of ass end of Hollywood, which was horror, because you weren't doing super jewels, you weren't doing the big budget features that were being done, you know, by Samuel Goldfish or Goldwyn, how he later became, or, you know, you were working for Universal, which was kind of always kind of, you know, Tin Pan Alley a bit, not quite Columbia, but a step above. And, you know, Phantom of the Opera was kind of like the first blockbuster, so there was this interest in it, but it was still, we need people who know what the hell they're doing in this genre. And that was... But when you look at those James Whale pictures... Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Bradford, I interrupted you. No, I'm just saying so that in those days, that was really the bizarre duo of Todd Browning and Lon Chaney. They were the two guys that were making these kind of, you know, uncanny films, these interesting, odd, in America. Lots of people were doing it in Europe, but in America, those were the two fairly well-known guys. And at that time, Chaney was trying to get out of his contract with Universal. He had one picture to finish. That was Phantom of the Opera before he was going to start a contract at MGM. And he would need help. And so Maddie would fascinate him, you know, because of what she's done. He would probably pull a film, watch it, and say, "You have obviously some real ability." First of all, I don't believe an 11-year-old girl made this. So what's up with that? And then, you know, so it's all in the book. So it's not so much like Forrest Gump, where it's just this wonderful convenience. To me, it's a lot more plausible because Hollywood in those days was such a small town. And then once the reputation builds, bringing into her sphere of influence people like James Whale or Todd Browning, they all knew each other and they were all working in that weird kind of world, and it would make sense why they wouldn't mention her. Right. You've got male egos that are so huge and dominating, but also the fact that her existence is inexplainable, and so you just seem insane if you brought her up in casual conversation. So she was kind of like the story you thought you knew. She's kind of like something the dark whispered. Secret. You know, something whispered and seldom acknowledged. Yeah. And so that her influence, though very, very real, itself takes on kind of a spectral cast, kind of a ghostly legend around the lot. You know, because she basically lives in Box 5 on the Phantom of the Opera set, the old Stage 28, which I actually worked on as an actor when that set was still erected, and I'd seen it and was inspired by it. You know, so there much really legends about around the? I mean, you talk in the book about the legend of a curse on the set of Phantom of the Opera. Is that an actual legend that you had read, or is this just your own poetic license? It's not a legend I had read. It's a legend I had heard firsthand. I met my wife on the set of Sequest. I was guest starring as an environmental terrorist. Believe it or not. I love Sequest. and she was Commander Hitchcock, right? And she was just hating it. They cut her hair, and she put her in pants, and she just wasn't happy. Anyway, we get to talking, and I'm spending a lot of time because you have this incredible futuristic submarine set in this kind of Gilded Age, Belle Epoque era, opera house. It's like, what is this weird juxtaposition? And so I'd start to talk to some of the older gaffers and prop people, and Hollywood's a very, it's a very family-oriented town. So I'm talking to people who's like the grandson of the grandson or the father, you know what I mean? So there's a lot of lineage in people that have deals on the lot. And a lot of them would say, the set stayed because in the 70s, we reused it, and we used it a lot. But apparently a few times they tried to take it down. Accidents would happen. It was incredibly well built. It was built by the craftsman who I think worked on the World's Fair in 1915 or 1911 or something. These Italian craftsmen who basically just built it out of springs and cement. It's incredibly well built. And it just stayed, and people just felt somewhat uncomfortable taking it down. And he told me stories about hearing things at night and pieces of paper fluttering from the balconies, and it was just kind of ghostly and cool, and maybe just a way to talk to some dumb schmuck actor who got nothing better to do. But it got me thinking that wouldn't it be cool if Hollywood ghosts, they can't all just be Cielo Drive or jumping off the H of the Hollywood sign. I mean, some of these sound stages have witnessed some incredible weird things. I mean, wouldn't one of them at least be haunted? So it just got me thinking, and so through the years, I just kind of kept it in the back of my mind, and I just kept.
Yeah, every character needs a home base, and this is an ideal one. One thing I was thinking about as you were talking about your love for a certain kind of horror that you watch on. When it's raining outside. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes new shows will hearken to this, right? Even one, in some of his work.
And absolutely. I mean, just if you even look at The Conjuring, too, or Dead Silence, he's taking an enormous page out of German Expressionism, which is really, really heartwarming for me. And a lot of directors are doing it. I remember the Spanish director's name that did The Others.
Guillermo del Toro. Absolutely. The Others. Now I can't remember.
Yeah, The Others. He did the Spanish original, and then he made that really what I thought was a really cool remake with Nicole Kidman. But it had that very gothic, creeping dread.
But when you talk about the black and white ones that you fell in love with as a young person in the 70s, what's funny about that, and I totally agree with you, it's that those have this love for the Gothic, this love for the scary, which always means in code and behind veils a fascination with death. But there's still that, in that era, there's that Forrest J. Ackerman way of looking at it all, which is somehow this has become comforting, and I'm not saying this is bad. I'm really interested in why is it that what originally in the 30s made people genuinely disturbed and worried. Mm-hmm. In the 70s, Forrest J. Ackerman is saying, let's comfort one another with these memories of how we used to fear death.
Right. Uh-huh.
And I know that is the kind of love of fearing death that you're actually attracted to. And I'm wondering, are we betraying the way the people looked at it in the 30s, or what is going on? Why?
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
My theory is Vietnam. Vietnam and John Carpenter. Vietnam and the first war we ostensibly lost, and we saw the horrible effects of that loss, very similar in fashion to what the streets of Weimar were like after the Germans lost the First World War. My uncle came back from Vietnam, hooked on heroin, and completely freaked out. Yeah. And the stories that I would stay up, because my father was a child and family therapist, and he counseled a lot of these servicemen. And I don't remember this, not been Greg Nicotero. One of these special effects guy had been in Vietnam and actually based his creature effects, his gore effects, on what he had witnessed in Vietnam. And if you look at the dawn of Carpenter's Halloween, which to me is kind of the benchmark of when horror grew up, became modern, and didn't become about the supernatural, it became about real, peril and death and mental, kind of dislodgement, which is odd because the original silent films were about crazy people. Yeah. Caligari, for instance, London at Midnight was really about two Ersatz vampires. I mean, that's what was interesting about Dracula. It's the first supernatural horror film Tom Browning entertained to make. Well, in my book I explain why. Why did a huckster, an old carny, a guy who used to be the living corpse, deign to make a supernatural horror film? Well, I explain it in at least to my liking, in Only the Dead Know Burbank. So it seems to me that we were kind of...
And that's still a lost film, by the way. London After Midnight.
Absolutely.
You know, by the way, Tom Savini was who you were thinking of. Tom Savini,
exactly, right.
Exactly.
You know, so I think to Americans it was no longer quaint, and it no longer had the glow of the antique on it. First of all, it's no longer black and white. The blood was and I mean, I don't want to discount the huge effect that Hammer horror had on it, but there's something about the American version of Halloween where the terror is in your neighborhood.
Yeah.
It's in your suburb, and the people in the movie dress like you, talk like you, act like you. That made it far less cuddly. You know what I mean?
Also, if you look at those things from, you know, you pick a really interesting one when you mention The Exorcist, which is like 1973. That's the end of the Gothic era, and if you look at those Gothic films, you know, there's still the dialogue is all declaimed, right? The language is all elevated. Everything is nobody talks like people talk, and then all of a sudden you have The Exorcist and The Omen and Rosemary's Baby. I mean, admittedly, Rosemary's Baby is like 1968, but suddenly people are talking like real people, and it looks like your brownstone or your neighborhood or your high rise. Yeah,
exactly.
You're right.
It becomes very, very familiar, and then you no longer have that wonderful distance because it's no longer this wonderful vacuum-formed little man that glows in the dark that you'd get to dominate. Now it's literally something seizing in the dark on your block.
Do you think that's the moment when older horror becomes nostalgic in a way that it maybe wasn't nostalgic in the 1930s? Or did it have some of that in the 30s?
Again, it's really, really hard to make general statements like that because when I do my research, you know, I mean, and it might have just been this great, you know, fakery and quackery of the Lemley, you know, machine that had nurses posted at the premiere of Dracula, and you had to, you know, have your health certificate to see Frankenstein. But the truth is, people had similar reactions to those films that they did to The Exorcist. However, there's all kinds of news articles about high truancy rates happening in neighborhoods where Frankenstein's showing. Kids are skipping school to go see it, even in 1931. So it always had kind of an appeal to a youth audience, like always. It's not talked about a lot, but it's if you really, like I did my research for 4 years, you really start to see that there is something kind of quaint and relatable to the creature in Frankenstein. Clearly, he's not a homicidal maniac. He's not Jason. He has a face, first of all. Yeah. You know what I mean? When you're looking at Jason and Michael. Exactly. So, you know, Rosemary's Baby to me is still kind of in that pantheon of dread. You know, it's still kind of coming out of the Frangiu, Bava, you know, semi-body horror Italian, you know, thing that's happening in Europe at that time. But Carpenter does something that, you know, and I guess you'd really have to say it really happened with Night of the Living Dead, which is, you know, but maybe it's because that was my generation. I remember when Halloween came out. Yeah. It completely changed the rules because it was so contemporary. Whereas even the Gothic horror films of the 30s and the 20s, you know, they didn't really look like where you lived because they were in Gothic castles and Gothic laboratories. And like you said, the people were, you know, kind of declaiming their dialogue and things like that. And it was this wonderful, removed, almost campy thing, but at the same time, lush and, you know, with beautiful contrast and very, very passionate. And you could have more than just a feeling of fear for the monster. You could have a lot of pathos. And so it was those feelings that I thought were really important to bring into the protagonist in this book, because I don't know what the point of view of a book written by Michael Myers would have been like. That's kind of more like you're getting into the block, you know, into like Robert Bloch said with Psycho, you know, like. But
it's such a wonderful concept. Your idea of having a person who understands the other side, who understands this darkness, understands what the Spanish would call the más allá, and is here, you know, going to kind of use that to infuse this new art form with a little bit of that.
Right. And then that sublimated by the extreme frustrations and limitations of a town that just wants to get its hand up your skirt and in your pocket.
Yeah.
And here she is, an actual artist from the old world, because in the beginning of the book, she's a model for Egon Schiele. I mean, she's part of the secessionist movement. So she's infused with these really deep old world artistic ideologies. And she comes to America where it's all about huckstering.
But that's such a wonderful statement on all of these artists coming from the old world in the 1930s.
Yeah.
Again, like you mentioned, Carl Laemmle and Val Lewton and all these guys who are bringing this idea of what the old world. And I think it was David Scal in one of his books. I think it was The Monster Show, where he said that Universal in the 40s the world of Universal looks like Europe as understood by a GI who kind of doesn't really quite know where he's going at any given time.
Exactly. That's the perfect analogy, because when you come to Carpenter's Halloween, that's the neighborhood you grew up in, motherfucker. That's not made up. That's not the old world street on the back lot of Universal. You live on that street, and all of a sudden the bets are off, and and then things start to shift and things start to change. So that sense of old world, like the interior landscape, leaves a bit, and it becomes a far more visceral dread. Whereas in the old horror black and white films, especially something like The Lodger, where you're not even sure if Laird Krieger's straight, what is his thing? It's a weird, effeminate. He's such a fascinating character.
No, you're right.
And he's so terrifying, and it's not just because he's masculinely. There's just something very untoward about him.
Yeah.
There's just something kind of big and sweaty and scary and weird. And in almost all of Val Lewton's films, you see that same thing. And you can say,
we talked about I Walked with a Zombie recently.
There you go. Perfect. That's the perfect
panel show.
And so much of it is just cutting to the dark. There's something brooding there in the dark. So in a sense, it kind of has a more universal appeal, because it has to
they're more dreamy. In a sense, having the girl sort of stand on a staircase and look out into the dark, this uncanny sense that there's something out there.
Right.
That appeals to, I think, very dark dreams. Very undefined but recognizable dreams. The notion of a bad guy walking down your street with a knife.
That's not orchestrated. That's purely visceral. That's just a pure visceral reaction. If you shout loud enough at me, I'm going to jump. But if you orchestrate it and get my skin to crawl, now we're in a different realm. I don't know if you probably know the movie Body Snatchers with Boris Karloff, but these wonderful scenes of just this creeping dread that has to be orchestrated. You know what I mean? You can't do it with jump scares. You have to build it. And you build it with
Let me ask you a question.
light.
Somebody asks you, because somebody asked me, this is literally today, I was at lunch, and this person says, well, I can't really watch old movies. He goes, because oftentimes he used the word cheesy. What he meant was, the dialogue doesn't sound realistic. It just does. And I said, well, that sounds like saying I can't watch, I can only watch modern dance. I can't watch ballet. And you're missing out on all the ballet. Do you ever run into this with people where you go, I'm going to go watch, I don't know, I Walked with a Zombie, and they go, I can't watch anything in black and white. Do you encounter those people?
Well, I encountered it to such a degree I decided to write a book about it. I seriously, I decided to say, no, the only way I'm going to get my point across, my passion across, my excitement about the genre across, is if I tell it from the point of view of the monster herself. Because you're not going to get it otherwise if it's like a third-person capture. It has to be through her eyes so that you're actually brought into that world. So it's not a world of gore and jump scares. It's a world of creeping dread and orchestrated horror and forgotten dreams and deferred ambitions and all of the things that actually were driving horror that after coming out of a losing end of a war. It's that whole mix which we still feel. I think, and so
I love the idea that she's a lovable monster, and to that extent. This makes it, I use the phrase Forrest Gump or Zelig, that actually in a way, this is a lot more like The Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, which told the dawn of comic books,
right?
From the perspective of people who were very like Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, You know, people fleeing the Holocaust, people doing whatever they were doing, getting to New York and finding out a way to start a whole new art form. And,
well, exactly. Or it's like inventing the lie detector machine and then creating a woman that has a golden lariat that makes you tell the truth. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
It's a lot of that. So you're not in the land of meta social commentary like you are today, because now it's all movies about movies. Not a bad thing. Fascinating. But in those days, there were no movies to make movies about. The genre didn't exist, so you had to make movies about primal dread, primal fear, primal things. So the idea in 1931 of a corpse coming back to life was utterly horrifying. To say it was bad enough. To talk about it was enough to get censorship in England. To show it was just unheard of. And, you know, again, Carl Laemmle Jr., I don't know how old he was at the time, in his 20s, and he's like, Pop, you got to make this film.
Yeah.
And it's just, you know, the adults of that era were like, that's absolutely insane. No one is going to want to see a movie about that. You know, because not even the novel was super successful in its day. You know, that had to be reprinted. It wasn't until Presumption, until you know, Shelley's Frankenstein was put on stage that people started to see it and get it and appreciate it. And
even then she did a rewrite, because Presumption comes out before, I mean, after Presumption is a hit, she rewrote that whole book. It's a major rewrite. It is not. She presents it in the introduction as some minor corrections here and there.
It's an excellent point. Right. and yet, if you think about it, no one has really ever cared about committing that book verbatim to just the same way they're not really. I mean, they're more interested in Peggy Webling than they are in Bram Stoker. They're more interested in her version of Dracula than really what Stoker put, because you're dealing with this epistle structure with letters.
It was Dean Webling. You're right about Webling, but she did Frankenstein. Dean. Am I wrong about this?
Well,
you're right about
Dean.
I know that she did Frankenstein.
Didn't have the rights. Because she was sniffing around both, you know, at the time, and again, the idea that it's the concept that is fascinating to these producers. It's not the material. Whereas today, you don't hire somebody to interpret Star Wars. You hire the guy who came up with Star Wars to do the first three. You understand?
Sure.
So I mean, it's such an amazing disconnect.
Yeah.
Because in those days, you could actually go back into and you're going way back into literature. Phantom of the Opera. I mean, these are old stories. You know. Yeah. And that's not what they're doing in Germany. In Germany, they're doing far more modern versions of this stuff. But that's not what the American market wants. They want this historical setting, you know. They want this Gothic setting, and
I have to say though, lately I've become really fascinated. I think because I neglected it for a really long time, but lately I've become really fascinated with mid-century, what I would call, I mean, almost neo-Gothics, and by that I mean things like King's Row and Peyton Place and stuff like that, which has become literally my most favorite thing recently, where these are non-horrors, and yet they have all these elements of Gothic horror in them, you know, and they're original, they're new, you know, they're not, and usually when they came out, bam, I mean, they got turned into a Hollywood picture usually within like 18 or 19 months, you know, just.
But you see, it's like in that conversation, the writings of John Cheever are kind of like Shelley. Like he's kind of stirring that pot about the discontent of the American middle class. But it takes until, you know, post, you know, film noir for filmmakers to finally get on board and say, wait a minute, people don't have to be shot or die or whatever. I mean, it can really just be like Valley of the Dolls or what have you. I mean, we really can tell these stories in a way that Cheever was telling way back in the 50s, that everything's not, the kids are not all right. We're not okay post-war America. And we never really have been okay. And even us that have money, we're not okay.
I wish we could continue along that line, because I have to say, I've only become recently aware that all the stuff from like the 50s and 60s, if you're looking at like Route 66 and you know all that Playhouse 90, they're obsessed with World War II. Obsessed. Yeah. Not in a great way. They're obsessed in a wounded, damaged way.
It didn't make us men, and they can't understand why the fuck didn't it make us men. We went in with a pair of balls, but we left without them. Why? So when Best Years of Our Lives comes along and tells it like it is, people don't know. People don't know what the hell to make of it. You know, I mean, because it's really telling the truth about, and likewise, that element of commentary, dread, horror, whatever you want to call it, whether things are coming out of the shadows or not. Maybe the shadows are just metaphorical in those films, but they still exist. That really attracts me, because to me, it's an orchestrated and an artistic type of storytelling, because it takes a lot of skill, I think, to get a visceral reaction from an audience when you're telling a story like that, as opposed to just putting them in a dark room and having something jump out of them. And I don't mean to degrade the films that do that, because they do that so effectively, I have difficulty watching them.
Well, like we said, modern dance versus ballet. I mean, they're different kinds. By the way, I haven't seen it, but there's a movie that Gene Kelly made called "It's Always Fair Weather" that I'm given to understand is basically like the best years of our lives. That it's his literally MGM musical about woundedness, and I'm fascinated by this idea. But I know that I've got to wrap this up. But for heaven's sake, the book is called "Only the Dead Know Burbank." You're a fascinating person. You know ridiculous amounts about horror movies.
I love it. Well, I just love the whole world and genre of it, because it really gets to the root of what we contemplate when, it's what we talk about when we talk about life. You can't help bringing death into the equation. We're always ruminating on it.
I mean, you got this done. In other words, like you said, I want to write a book about my fascination with this world and with this history, and I'm going to create a sort of a monster that fits into it and retell. And this is my obsession. And you found a publisher to go along with you about that, because I can imagine showing this to a lot of publishers and going, you know what? If you could take this story and actually just kind of make it contemporary, but sort of make references.
I got that for years. I got it for years, and I just thought, I just think that there's something here. I just feel that people are going to be fascinated by this, by what they think. This is the story behind the story, what they think they know. Because it doesn't just deal with horror. It also deals with the price of ambition. It deals with what it costs to be an artist in Hollywood. It deals with the sacrifices between mothers and daughters. What does it take to become the thing you want to be, and what are you willing to give up to get that? Because I've lived and worked in this town, it's not solely about that obsession, because a lot of what's driving Maddie are things that I, as an artist and actor and writer in Hollywood, have experienced. I can infuse her with things that are horrifying to me, but wouldn't qualify genre-wise as horror. So that.
But I mean, good for you really, actually figuring out a way to just go, you know what? I'm going to write the book that I want to write.
Yeah. I kind of think you've got to be left with that. You have to be left. I mean, what else? Why else play? If you can't just do it, you know what I mean? And luckily, I found two guys that were crazy enough, or had such incredible lapse in judgment that they said, "Yeah, we think this is great. Let's run with it." And so we did. And I mean, the only reason I ever want to see anything is when I hear somebody talk about it, it's because they love it and they were passionate about it. Even if I don't care about the genre. I'm so passionate about cooking or race car driving or whatever it is. And then you see it, so you're not really looking about a movie about something per se. You're really having an interface with someone's passion. And someone's excitement.
Oh,
and
that's
to me,
better than anything else. Yeah.
That's really what that's kind of what I wanted to communicate. So if someone out there says, "Oh, I don't really like Gothic horror," I'm like, okay, that's fine. Give it a try. And see if I can't win you over just based on the fact that I get off on it so much. Maybe it's infectious. We'll see.
Absolutely. Gosh. Okay. Well, we could probably go on like this, honestly, for another hour, because there are a lot of things that I would love to ask you about. But but I can't. But seriously, Harper Perennial.
But you can do it anyway. Break the rules.
Yes. No, I've got to talk about Frankenstein, 1931, in like half an hour. So I've got to get my notes in order. But we got to talk about Peggy Webling. Peggy Webling. Yeah. That's a terrible name to try to say live.
Peggy Webling? It is.
Yeah.
It is.
There's a book, by the way, that you might enjoy called Frankenstein: A Cultural History by Susan Hitchcock.
I know it.
Well, excellent. There we go.
Oh, yeah.
I've lived with that book for like a year doing some other research. All right. Well, anyway, everybody can find the book. It is out, correct? It's already out.
No, it's not. It doesn't come out until October 18th.
Oh, my gosh.
On October 18th.
Next week. All right.
Next week, in a, commercial, independent, Amazon-ish bookseller near you, if you're interested, yeah, that's where it'll be. And you've seen the cover. It's really hard to miss. Black.
Oh, no, it's wonderful. It's got Phantom of the Opera on it. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for your very valuable time and for talking about Only to Know Burbank. Yeah, and have a fantastic evening. I will talk to you soon.
Thank you very much for your time.
You bet.